great many Americans today think of the 1950s as happy days, but as this model of Sputnik, the first Soviet satellite to orbit the Earth, reminds us, it was also in the 1950s that the Soviets began to catch up. In the early 50s, a great many Americans laughed at this German bug, but by the end of the 1950s, we were in love with the Volkswagen, particularly its gas mileage. It took Detroit a long time to catch up. In last week's mileage competition, a Chevrolet did come first, but its engine was built in Japan. In the 1950s, we were not quite as gripped with television as we are today. You know, we don't make black and white television sets in America anymore. In the 1950s, at the beginning, this is what the television sets looked like. There were only 4 million sets in the country. By the end of the decade, there were 52 million. In the 1950s, Jonas Salk invented the polio vaccine, and millions of children were protected for the first time against polio. In the 1980s, we don't think very much about polio. We think about AIDS. You may have heard President Reagan at his news conference last night talking about how much government will contribute to AIDS research. Well, the critics think it is not enough. Here's a great first from the 1950s. The first McDonald's. In the Soviet-American competition, what Sputnik had shown us was that Soviets had a capacity to launch a missile and land it on the United States. You know what a great many Americans did? They ran out and they built themselves fallout shelters. And we were so concerned with communism far away from home that we hardly noticed Fidel Castro and the revolution in Cuba. Far away from home, we were concerned with war. The war in Korea was stalemated. We elected Dwight Eisenhower to end it, and he did. And this is the original armistice agreement that was signed between the North Koreans, the Chinese, and the United Nations at Panmunjom. The year was 1953. And this is where it ended. Panmunjom was a pretty famous place in the 1950s. They constructed a special building so the armistice could be signed. Because of some changes in the demilitarized zone, it is over there now on the North Korean side. The New York Times reporter here then said it was more like signing a declaration of war than it was a truce agreement.
The Peace Pagoda in Panmunjom. From your seat in this theater, you are an eyewitness to the step-by-step process of the beginning of the end of the fighting in Korea.
General William Harrison signed for the United Nations.
There were a lot of commies on the other end. They were all dressed up in their best uniforms. But I didn't believe in bowing and scraping to communists, so I just waited in my old suntans and didn't make any ceremony out of it at all. I just wasn't going to do it.
You can still feel the tension here at Panmunjom, and of course Korea is still divided. Down there in the south, 40,000 Americans still on duty, lest there'd ever be another invasion from the communist north. Korea was the first war that America had failed to win. It didn't lose either. And the reason the fighting stopped here was because of a threat from President Eisenhower. Shortly before his death, in several very candid conversations with friends and historians, the president reflected on many of the actions he'd taken while he was in the White House. And one of the things he did was to tell the North Koreans and the Chinese that if the fighting didn't stop here, he would widen the war and he'd use atomic weapons.
Either this armistice had to be signed and without any further dilly-dallying, or I was no longer going to be bound by the so-called gentlemen's agreements, and I was going to use whatever was necessary to win.
It was an effective threat. It was also the last time an American president would explicitly threaten to use atomic weapons. In 1953, atomic weapons were not unthinkable.
Eisenhower said to me, and I was deeply shocked, he said, "You British look upon the atomic weapon as something totally new. But you've got to remember, throughout history, new weapons have in due course become conventional weapons. The atomic bomb will soon become a conventional weapon." I must say my jaw dropped.
Washington's cavalier attitude would soon change. When the Soviets stepped up from the atomic to the hydrogen bomb, we began to realize that using these weapons might mean the other side using them too. Recognizing the need for a strategy to manage America's relations with the communists, President Eisenhower commissioned a study. Project Solarium was top secret for almost 30 years afterwards.
I think it probably was a result of sort of two factors. One, the death of Stalin, which took place fairly early within the first few months of the Eisenhower administration. And the second was Eisenhower's own instincts, I guess largely as a result of his military experience, of liking to have staff analyses and discussions of potential problems or areas that were going to require action.
The president's advisors considered many options, including overthrowing the communist government in China, and even what the cost would be of a third world war. This paragraph from the Solarium Project's final report summed up what would be America's policy towards the communists for the next decade. The United States should take feasible political, economic, propaganda, and covert measures designed to create and exploit troublesome problems for the USSR. While the United States was settling for a draw in Korea, we were already becoming involved in Vietnam. One of America's World War II allies was on the verge of a disastrous defeat in a place called French Indochina.
Crisis in the Indochina War.
The French were fighting to hold on to their colonial empire. They were being beaten by Ho Chi Minh. The French were frustrated and decided to go for a quick victory. They chose a plain in northern Vietnam. For the French, it became hell in a very small place.
Casualties are heavy on both sides at Dien Bien Phu.
Americans would know a few years later what battlefield obstacles the Vietnamese could overcome. The Viet Minh, led by their commander, General Giap, came from hundreds of miles away, carrying with them tons of heavy artillery. They surrounded the French garrison. The siege lasted for months. The United States had been paying for 80% of the French war effort, but Eisenhower refused French pleas to save the garrison. He would not use American soldiers to perpetuate French colonialism. As glorified in this North Vietnamese film, Dien Phu fell on May the 7th, 1954.
I think that the Dien Bien Phu victory was a historic victory that was very significant. Dien Bien Phu was a forging ground and also a place to gain experience on modern warfare, so that later on we could expand this to win victory in the fight against the American imperialists.
The defeated French troops were marched out of Dien Bien Phu, and French colonial domination in the region came to an end. The events in Indochina were a paradox. Eisenhower would not support an ally's colonial adventures, but communism in the region had to be checked, and the president believed that if it were not, one country after another could fall to the communists. Following a recorded news conference in 1954, it became known as the domino theory.
You have a row of dominoes set up, and you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it'll go over very quickly.